Good morning. Welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. My name is Eric Sayers. I'm a non-resident fellow here at AEI. Today we have a great event for you over the next hour. Peace in the Pacific, a conversation with former Indo-Pacific commanders. We've got two gentlemen who really need no introduction. The last two active Indo-PACOM commanders, Admiral Phil Davidson and Admiral Harry Harris. With full disclosure, I had a chance to work for Harry in 2016-18 on his CAG, so any of the difficult questions I'll throw Phil's way per Harry's request. But we have the next hour to really dig into some of these questions. There's a range of issues, so I want to really be efficient and cover a lot of ground with the time. So thank you both for joining us today. We'll spend the first 30. Thank you. We'll spend the first 30 minutes covering some of the questions I'm going to throw out to you, and then we have an opportunity to go to the virtual audience. You could submit those through the AEI portal on this event's website, and we'll get to those as we can, in the second half of the hour. So I wanted to start with a big picture question for both of you, just a couple of minutes to dive in, and that's just on broader U.S.-China dynamics. How do you assess the current state of U.S.-China strategic competition in the region, in the Indo-Pacific, and what are some of the main challenges and opportunities for advancing U.S. interests as you see it a few years after leaving the command? I'll start with you, Harry.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. It's an important question. It's the question for the decade, really. I think that we're at a position with China, unlike any that I've seen in my career. I think that we are at an impasse on those strategic questions of going forward. I think we've spent a lot of time over the past decades trying to negotiate with China on issues that they're not going to negotiate with, and we keep trying to do that. They are profoundly committed to their position. So I think that our position should change. I think we should change to a position of negotiating coexistence rather than trying to negotiate away China's view of Taiwan, the South China Sea, or the East China Sea, the Uyghurs and all that. Those are areas that China views as their fundamental national interests. And we view them as our interests as well. So they're not negotiable either on China's part or our part. And we ought to acknowledge that, accept that, and then work on ways to strengthen our relationship with Taiwan, to strengthen our freedom of navigation in the East and South China Seas, to continue to criticize, rightly so, Chinese genocide, the State Department word, against their own people, the Uyghurs. And we should negotiate coexistence in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific region, and not waste time on trying to negotiate away what China views as their fundamental national interests.
Thanks, sir. Phil, can we go over to you for some opening thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Eric, as well. I mean, certainly the relationship is quite troubled, right? Just the trajectory over the last several years, and everyone in this audience knows that all too well. But it's clear that the prosperity and security objectives of the two nations are divergent. I think the desire to get China into a close policy and strategic discussion over the last several months has been very troubled. China has been refusing it outright. Xi's failure to appear at international forums, even when he's physically there, is showing his disdain for the security and prosperity objectives that I think the Western world has for themselves. I think it's particularly alarming, sickening, really, the party's comments over the weekend about Israel. The way ahead, I think, is one that we should all talk about here today. Those are the benefits of, and they accrue to both Harry and I and you, Eric, when we hear from the audience today on what that way ahead is. But to Harry's very good point, the opportunities are bleak to close the gaps. Back to you.
Harry, do you want to pick up on that? Just challenges and opportunities. How do you balance that out?
Yeah, thanks. First, Eric, I want to give a shout out, a hats off to Phil. He succeeded where I failed, and that's to get resourcing, additional DoD resourcing to the Indo-Pacific theater. The Pacific Defense Initiative, that's all on him, and my hat's off to him for that. That said, I think our biggest challenge is our lack of adequate resourcing to meet the task ahead. If China remains the fundamental threat for the rest of this decade and into the next decade, we are not resourced, in my opinion, correctly for that challenge. So that becomes that's a big challenge. We're also China's own demographics. They've run an upside down demographic, and their economic failure here in the early part of the 2020s. Brought by their own COVID policy and their hollowness of their some of their economic bases. I think that those challenges create an opportunity for China to act sooner rather than later. So that brings us into the quote unquote Davidson window, which Phil is more expert on than I am, and what the administration has talked about. From now until 2030 is the time of danger. So I think those are the challenges that we face: the lack of resourcing, China's own upside down demographics, and their own economic challenges. And these things are coalescing. Plus, when you add to that the fact that the world gets a vote, right? So we see that play out today with Russia's invasion, immoral, illegal invasion of Ukraine. And the Hamas terrorist attacks against Israel. So that plays out. That takes resources to deal with that. We have a broken Congress that's unable to come together and do the things that they're supposed to do. And finally, our biggest, in my view, our remaining challenge is one of diplomacy. The Israel case is a case in point. Here we are. We're 10 days or 9 days today into the Hamas terrorist attacks against Israel, and we do not have a confirmed ambassador to Israel yet. It took 2 years to get an ambassador to Korea after I left, and Korea is one of our treaty allies. Diplomacy and diplomats matter, and until the administration working with the Senate can get their acts together, then we're shooting ourselves in the foot, literally and figuratively. Over.
Yeah, that's well said. Maybe I can kick this back over to you, Phil, and just the broader question of how we balance our interests and our priorities, which we've said now 3 successive administrations should be in the Pacific, but which, as Harry said, the world has a vote too. On 60 Minutes last night, President Biden was asked about this, and he said, we're the United States of America, for God's sake, the most powerful nation in history. We can take care of both of these and still maintain our overall international defense. Both of these not meaning China and something else, but the ongoing war in Ukraine, and now this unfolding conflict and war, as we're likely to see it in the days ahead in Gaza and Israel. So how do we, how do we balance, these pressing conflicts that are unfolding that are our interest now with this medium and long-term interest in this decade you talked about? Is this opportunity for us and also a period of danger for our allies with all these different conflicting timelines?
Thank you, Eric. Yeah, it's a key question, no doubt. I mean, certainly, do we have the mental capacity and the attention in the command structure in the Department of Defense? Yeah, certainly, to stay focused on our problems. Do we have the resources? Well, we have to ponder what the actual future is. And when you rack up Russia's assault on Ukraine, when you rack up the diabolical evil that is Hamas, when you rack up truly the long-range objectives of the Communist Party of China, which is not Hong Kong, it is not the South China Sea, it's not the Uyghurs, it's not Tibet, it's not even Taiwan. It's to supplant US global leadership and replace it with global leadership led by the Communist Party of China. And one only need to look at the potential risks, not just to our prosperity and security, but to our lives and our liberty. What the Communist Party of China is capable of as a closed and authoritarian structure when it comes to that. In my mind, clearly more resources are going to be required in the Department of Defense as we move forward. Think about these threats. The challenges of authoritarianism, the challenges of chaos are vast and getting worse. More than half the population on the globe lives under authoritarianism or lives under chaos. Western values are under assault. And if we are going to preserve the basis of those, our lives and our liberty, we need to be thinking about the resources for the long term.
Let's stay on that 1 second. The resourcing piece, what's your assessment? As Harry said, you worked hard on the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. We got that through Congress. You submitted, and now Admiral Aquilino, your successor, submitted multiple reports, but there's still been disagreements over that funding for some key things like Guam in Congress, on munitions, et cetera. So what's your assessment of how far we've come on the resourcing side since you were in the seat, and where we should go from here, given that there may be opportunities for additional resourcing as part of an emergency appropriations package, alongside Ukraine and Israel funding in the months ahead in Congress?
No, thank you, Eric. Well, I think we are in a better place than we were in decades gone by. I think Americans need to understand the real nature of the changes made across the joint force during the era of coin and constabulary action that occurred after 9/11 and really up until 2021. I like to frame it for Americans when I speak with them to remind them that the U.S. Navy had more sailors on the ground at the peak of the wars of Afghanistan and Iraq than we actually have in our entire submarine force. That is profound change that, you could argue was balancing, it was adding resources, whatever the case may be. But as we think about the future and the behaviors we're observing directly from Putin, from Xi, we're going to have to think that fundamental change on the order of what the Navy provided the rest of the joint force during the previous 2 decades is going to be required in order to secure our liberties in the future.
Great. There's going to be a lot of China-Taiwan questions. I'm going to get to those. I want to make sure we cover a couple of other topics in the region that are also of interest, starting with the DPRK, and Harry, I'll come to you on that, and then moving to India, in the Indian Ocean region. Maybe I can ask you, Phil, about that. So, Ambassador Harris, you were not just commander of the Indo-Pacific, but then spent 3 years in Seoul as the ambassador to Korea. This issue was very much at the forefront in 2017, 2018, around the time you were there. But it's, given all these other conflicts, given China and Taiwan and other issues, it's fallen a bit off the Washington headlines, although the threat hasn't diminished in any way, and certainly not in East Asia or for the South Korean government. How do you assess, the current Korean Peninsula, the stability there, the North Korea threat, and how Washington should be thinking about this when so many other priorities are on the plate?
Yeah, sure. Thankfully, we have a 4-star Army commander in Korea that's responsible for fighting on the peninsula and will take operational control of Korean forces if the armistice fails. So I guarantee you, the general on camera has not lost any focus on the threat from North Korea, which is far greater today than it was yesterday, and certainly greater than when I was the ambassador, and before that when I was the Indo-PACOM commander. Korea continues to grow its capabilities, its strategic missile capabilities, ballistic missile capabilities. It got a pass during the previous administration when it perfected its targeting, in my opinion, through repeated use of short-range ballistic missiles and refined its technologies. And now it's partnered with Russia. Apparently, it is partnered with Russia. All I know is what I read in the news. But in exchange for North Korean munitions, China will provide, or Russia rather, will provide technology to enable North Korea to be successful in its space aspirations. So they are far better today, capability-wise, than they were before. That said, I believe the alliance is stronger now than it was before. I think with President Yoon and his partnership with President Biden and Prime Minister Kishida in Japan, I think that the three of them together recognize the threat. And I'm pleased that President Yoon has placed the U.S.-South Korea alliance as the center point of his foreign policy. And that means a return to joint military exercises and a return to resourcing the South Korean military to better meet the threat from the north.
That's excellent. Thank you. On India, of course, Harry, when you were commander, it was Pacific Command, and it was just as Phil, you took over, the command's name was changed, probably more appropriately geographically to Indo-Pacific Command. Can we talk a bit about the Indian Ocean region and its interests and the U.S.-India relationship as you seeing it, progress and unfold the last couple of years, both in the maritime domain, but also ashore where a lot of training happens, and given the India threats along the disputed border with China?
Yeah, I mean, the interests of the Indian Ocean are succinct still. We, India, the globe, desires free and open Indian Ocean that's capable of helping advance the prosperity of the globe. Our relationship with India is on a positive trajectory. I think too often we think that there's so much there, we could be in a better place. We are on a long journey with India. Their concerns about our relationships with Pakistan, our objectives in Afghanistan more recently, were fundamentally divergent. I think one of the very positive developments is the transparency and robustness of the conversation that's at least occurring at this point. One of the things that struck me when I was newly reported to Indo-PACOM was the capability of the Indian destroyer that was dispatched to RIMPAC in 2018. They were the most enthusiastic bunch of, I think, of any of the events I observed, both in port and underway. And it's a relationship that, while on a journey, on a trajectory, is one that we should continue to try to nurture, continue to try to assist, certainly consult with India over time, but understand that the ultimate destination of our partnership still has a long way to go, not just in economic terms and diplomatic terms, but certainly in security terms as well.
That's great. Thank you. On nuclear weapons, strategic issues, the administration issued their congressional nuclear posture review last year, but just this week, the independent review happened, nuclear posture review, with a bipartisan group of members, and they came to some pretty stark conclusions. Again, people from kind of different walks of life on what the United States should do about its nuclear weapons investments. And they talked about the concerns of China's growing arsenal alongside Russia in the context of the Ukraine conflict. We talked about an aging, triad and other investments. Of course, these questions come up in the Pacific from an extended deterrence perspective: Japan, Korea, Australia, and other allies. Of course, this is a strategic command issue, but from where you sat at Indo-PACOM and your perspective, today, having retired, how do you view the triad in our modernization efforts, and how our allies, are either concerned or reassured by our own extended deterrence capabilities? I can go to either one of you on that. You want to start, Harry, if you have some thoughts?
Sure, I'll start. Our allies don't trust the United States enough on extended nuclear deterrence. I think we were better now in the past few years than we were before. And that matters, because when they lose that trust, when they believe that we're not going to extend our nuclear deterrent to them, that's when they will proliferate. and build their own nuclear weapons, and you can't blame them for that. So I think it's imperative that we continue to underscore our commitment to extended nuclear deterrence of our allies that we've provided that deterrent to. Japan and Korea and Australia come to mind. I think that that we must resource completely, whatever it takes, our nuclear triad. There are those that say we only need 2 parts of the triad, and that's wrong. We need all 3 parts, all 3 elements. The ground-based, the air-based, and submarine-launched capabilities are each important and must be improved, modernized, and resourced. The Chinese are building a strategic deterrent capability that's eye-watering when you compare it with what we have. They are unlimited by any treaty to do otherwise, and so I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned about our continued debate on how much resources we should expend rather to improve our own strategic nuclear deterrent capability.
Just staying on that, Harry, are there other changes you would make to posture? Certainly the investments to the triad, as you said, but we hear a lot from maybe track 2 dialogues in Korea and Japan. Well, maybe there should be nuclear weapons forward deployed in Guam. Maybe there should be other ways in the inter-theater to reassure. Of course, we have SSBNs in a theater, but that's not as publicly visible or known as it would be in the case of Guam. Anything you change?
I think it is a mistake to put nuclear weapons, American nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula or in Japan or in the Philippines. I won't speak to Guam, but on foreign soil, those, we had them in Korea, we removed them for a good reason. We don't need them there, but we have to continue to reinforce our extended nuclear deterrence for South Korea. Bringing in a nuclear submarine, the USS, a nuclear ballistic missile submarine, the USS Kentucky, is a great demonstration. We can't do that routinely, and that for that bright, shining moment, everyone knows where that submarine is for the right reasons and also for the wrong reasons. But it's important to demonstrate that capability.
Oh, switching gears, Harry mentioned the 2027 timeline. Whether you like it or not, the Davidson window, as it's now become known in the last 2 or 3 years. I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that, to talk about your thinking, when you did that congressional testimony in 2021, and how you see several years later, 3 years out from that window, how you see that unfolding in terms of modernization and our response to this dangerous decade.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. I mean, it was an interesting conversation. I mean, we were just talking about the capability of the nuclear deterrent, which people forget was also a bit of back and forth between me and several senators at the same hearing. But when I walked away from the hearing, I thought were going to be, much more newsworthy than my response about Taiwan. And, again, my response about Taiwan isn't the entirety of my thesis, right? It was a very specific question. I mean, Senator Sullivan and I were talking, and he was articulating the very concerning reports he was hearing from intelligence, from allies and partners in the region. And he asked me, and this is virtually a direct quote, given those alarming reports, what does that ask me, what does that tell you about your timeline for any potential conflict in the Taiwan Strait? Well, that's a pretty broad brush of capabilities and scenarios that are applicable in that era. So my response was forthright. It was, I think our concerns are manifest this decade, and I'm concerned about the next 6 years. It comes from not only, my own Indo-Pacific and the intelligence apparatus observations of advancements in the PLA and what they were accomplishing, certainly ahead of schedule. It also reflected reports of political machinations within China, and it certainly reflected the kind of dialogue I was hearing from allies and partners across the region. The fact that it's become a moniker of its own is a little bit frustrating, because the reality is, within a few months later, the administration in form of the Secretary of State and the Director of National Intelligence both affirmed the timelines. And I think those and the currency that you're hearing from the reports are much more relevant today. That said, I think it has been effective, certainly without my agenda behind it, in helping to garner bipartisan support within, certainly on the Hill. And it has been effective at obtaining at least some of the resources in the visions that I put forth, and that Long Aquilino was certainly making better. So there's there. Now we're 3 years later. Is everything on schedule for what I had hoped and the reports that I submitted to Congress? No, not exactly. Are they reasonably on trajectory? Yes. What would help them the most? On-time defense budgets, the proper resourcing and prioritization of the threats to the United States around the globe, the certain consideration of need and requirement of our allies and partners in the region. They're very important growth in budget, which is something that I should add here. Since my testimony 2.5 years ago, you've seen a couple of really profound changes in the security environment. The first is AUKUS, people can argue about phase one being a really long game, and it is. But Australia, 26 million people, ponied up $3 billion to get started. That is a significant ante up. Really excellent. Second, pillar two, cyber, quantum, AI. We have a deep defense and innovation relationship with India. Leveraging that with the UK going forward, very powerful signal across the region. And it was noticed in the PRC. The most important security change, the most important positive security development in the region since the turn of the century was Japan's new national security strategy announced in December last year, and then the alliance announcements made between Prime Minister Kishida and President Biden in January. Truly profound. Without summarizing the entirety of those announcements, the key takeaway, I think, is the identification that our national security concerns have converged. And Japan's decision on that is to increase their defense budget, not from 1% of GDP to 2% GDP. And they are demonstrating that they are on that trajectory on the timeline that they announced. That is extremely powerful. The types of work that we do between the US and Japan, the co-development of systems like the SM-32B ballistic missile defense missile, the shared equipments like the spy radar, the Aegis weapon system, the F-35, Patriot missile system, PAC-3s, I could go on and on. And the opportunity to deepen those technological and defense relationships going forward, have like equipments, deeply advance our tactical level, deeply advance the operational level coordination with their establishment of the Joint Permanent Headquarters, strengthen ties with Indo-Pacom at the operational level. These are all really, really important developments. And I think, serve not only the nation's interests, but certainly our nation's and allied interests throughout the Indo-Pacific quite well in this decade and going forward.
Very well put. That's funny how you noted in the hearing that you thought there would be a different headline coming out of the event than the one that did. And oftentimes the intermix of the press and kind of the policy discussion can kind of produce maybe a different outcome like that. But I do think the 2027 timeline, well debated as a timeline issue only, is still helpful because it has created a forcing function, as you said, in Washington. Not that this is a distant problem, amorphous somewhere in the future in the 2030s, but this decade requires action now to be ready for this decade. Harry, did you have anything you want to comment on the 2027 piece?
Yeah, let me just say that I agree with the imminency with an I of the challenge. Phil says 2027. Avril Haines said that the risk from China by 2030 is acute. That's her words. I think Jake Sullivan echoed that. So taking 2027 to 2030, that's the decade of danger. And going back to one of your earlier questions about the challenges that we face, I'm concerned that we're building a modern Navy and Air Force for the 2030s, the mid 2030s to the 2040s, when the challenge ahead of us is in this decade, not the next decade. So I worry about that. I think we have a resource a mismatch. We have a say-do mismatch with our economic policy and our defense policy, and what we say what the threat is, and when we say that threat is going to face us, and we're building a force that's going to unfortunately shoot behind the Peking duck, if you will. I want to give shout out my hats off to AEI's own Corey Shockey for pointing this out in a piece that she wrote back in February. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
Well, it's a good point about building a Navy and Air Force for the 2030s, but that's also an industrial based issue. Even if we had all the resources today, we wouldn't be able to build, more submarines, more aircraft, et cetera. So, what are your thoughts on what we can do in this decade to accelerate? Is that posture changes? Is that munitions and more payloads?
Yeah, I mean, we need to buy. We need to stop depending on countries like China for the energetics material that goes into our munitions. Right, we need to stop depending on China for rare earths that go into our cyber and IT capabilities, and we need to develop those. Unfortunately, we're behind. We've allowed ourselves to fall behind in our industrial capacity and all the rest. But you can't build an industrial policy to meet the challenges from the PRC by wishing it would happen. You have to resource it, and you have to resource it immediately. If it doesn't ramp up until 2030 and we start today, that's better than starting next year and not ramping up until 2031, right? We have to start that. We have to acknowledge that we have dug a hole and we dove right into that hole. And we have to start building our way out of it. There's a lot of work in Congress that's being done to build a third nuclear shipyard. I think we can do that. We ought to look at using in the interim, using our allies' capabilities. There's no better shipbuilding place in the world than South Korea, Japan, and the like. We ought to use them to build some of to increase our capabilities. I know that's not optimal. We want to bring those shipyards to the U.S. And rightly hire American workers to build those ships, but we're approaching an extremis here. We need to be creative in how we go about fixing the industrial policy shortfalls that we created ourselves.
On Taiwan, there's a few questions from the audience. If there was, a hypothetical kinetic operation or attack on Taiwan, where do you think our allies would fall? Would this just be a U.S.-Taiwan fight? The Japanese, the Australians especially, that's their own political decision to make, but certainly we train, we operate together, so that decision could be made one day by the leaders jointly. How do you see the reaction in Canberra and Tokyo to a conflict in the Taiwan Strait?
I'll start, and Phil, I'll defer to Phil. He's more current on it than I am. I think Japan will be with us, maybe not at the beginning, but they recognize completely the threat from the PRC. The previous administration in Australia, their defense minister, Peter Dutton, he famously said that, quote unquote, or of course, unquote, Australia would be with the United States if the United States defended Taiwan. Now, the current administration, the Albanese administration, hasn't backed away from that, but they haven't reiterated that either. But I think Australia would be with us. I don't think South Korea, you can make that definitive statement about South Korea today because of their economic dependence on China. But we have to be ready and willing to go it alone with Taiwan, and that's the challenge that faces Admiral Aquilino and the Indo-Pacific Command today, and the Joint Force writ large.
Phil, anything there?
Yeah, no, I agree with Harry's assessment completely. I just put a finer point on the Japanese piece. I mean, they believe that their flanks are directly at risk in any Taiwan conflict, and are certainly pondering, what would become of the security architecture, not only if Taiwan falls, but if Taiwan is coerced into a negotiating position that's inimical to Japanese concerns when it comes to the freedoms of the sea, not just territorial concerns in and around Japan. And I'll leave it at that. For everyone, we can't sit here and describe, every element of the context that would define the policy challenge and the leadership challenge that Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and others will have in the heat of the moment. But I'm quite confident in the allies that we have in the region, and eyes wide open. Harry hit it just right. You have to be prepared for the worst and hope for the best.
I'll come back to you, Harry. One this topic, just to expand it, though. You've both been to Taiwan this year. Sounds maybe, Harry, like you're going again in the coming weeks. What's your assessment of Taiwan's own readiness? There's an election in January for the next president, a bigger election that will kind of set the course after 8 years of pretty stable leadership by President Tsai. So maybe I'll start with you, Harry, and if you have anything to add to the last thing.
Look, Taiwan is an innovation nation. They're a democracy, and they're a global force for good, and they deserve all the help that we can give them. I believe, based on my observations on the ground, and Phil may have different observations, but I believe that they get it. They get the challenge, and they get what they have to do to be ready for it. Russia on Ukraine has helped them understand that challenge viscerally, if you will. They've changed their conscription law from a 4-month conscription, which is, in my opinion, meaningless, to a 12-month conscription for all young men in Taiwan. That's important. They get it. They understand the need to have a force in waiting and a force in readiness. And so I think that they're much better prepared today mentally to face the challenge from China. And I think they will defend their country, just like they're seeing Ukraine defend itself from that. I think that we, in the United States, we need to do a better job of describing to the American people, though, why Taiwan matters. Why is Taiwan a global force for good? Why does it deserve to be defended by the United States? The president has said 4 times now that we're going to defend Taiwan. Each time it's been walked back by someone who's either unelected or unconfirmed by the Senate or both. The president has said we're going to defend Taiwan, and I think we need to take him at his word and prepare accordingly. And I'm for sure certain that Admiral Aquilino is preparing accordingly to meet that challenge.
You mentioned Ukraine. Just maybe last question on Taiwan. What are the lessons that Taiwan should learn and we should learn of the nature and the character of warfare as it's unfolded in Ukraine in the last 18 months?
Well, I think they're learning that they need to be capable of defending themselves by themselves with the help of their friends and allies, with the help of the United States, as Ukraine is. I think they're learning that they need to have someone that's as publicly forceful as President Zelensky in Ukraine is. I think that Ukraine is teaching them the need for public diplomacy, to have the right people around the world and a willingness to travel and defend themselves in different public's eyes, if you will. I think they're learning that. I think China, the PRC, is learning also. They have to be wondering if their generals and admirals who are schooled in the Soviet system are as inept as those from Russia appear to be. They have to be wondering if the PLA and the PLAN is as inept as the Russian Army and Navy appear to be. So they're learning a lot as well, and they also are learning that control of the internet is vital. And I think that their control of the internet in China is better than Russia's control of the internet in Russia. And they're learning that they have to really lock that down. I'm sure they're taking lessons from the Starlink example and all of that. So they are learning as well, just as I believe that Taiwan is learning from the Ukraine model.
Phil?
Yeah, I mean, it's perfectly articulated by Harry. I would simply add that we can't forget that the PRC has a strategy in execution vis-a-vis Taiwan, and that is to erode the military operating norms and the international norms to the point that they can force Taiwan to negotiate on the PRC's terms. That requires consideration, careful consideration by Taiwan, certainly by the United States, and by our allies and partners in the region who are interested in, the status quo when it comes to the security architecture in the region. What am I getting at exactly? Well, yes, Taiwan certainly needs to absorb and should certainly recognize that the PRC is absorbing that, a slow grinding infantry attack or even amphibious assault, if that were to occur, are pretty grinding affairs. But they're certainly observing that the innovations on the battlefield that both Ukraine is doing and frankly, Russia is learning as well, would result in probably a much more comprehensive attack from the PRC. Harry's point about the internet, information, diplomacy, the economic factors, energy, these all would be, I believe, at risk. But back to my point about, the PRC strategy in execution. Taiwan cannot be prepared only with asymmetric means in case of an assault. That is too narrow a scenario to be resourcing solely. We run the risk as the PRC continues to try to erode the operating norms with ever more increasing violations of the air defense identification zone of Taiwan, with ever more increasing violations of the midline, with ever more increasing blockade rehearsals and multi-domain attack rehearsals from 360 degrees. Taiwan's ability to respond with patrols at sea, in the air, missile coverage, things like that. If those equipments start to break down, we are in a very difficult spot, and an assault wouldn't actually be required, or any other kind of conflict. We have to be careful that we, the United States, Taiwan, absolutely, as a matter of business first, are resourcing their conventional needs in order to deter on a day-to-day basis the broad array of scenarios that the PRC could actually execute. And as importantly, the day-to-day observations they're seeing right now of the PRC strategy and execution.
I wanted to talk about the Philippines as well. I think in recent years, Taiwan has become correctly a focal point for discussion for all the reasons we're talking about here. And as a result, maybe relatively, the South China Sea, maybe moved off the headlines a little bit. But the Philippine Alliance, let's talk about that a bit. You both served, during the Duterte years, which were uncertain, to say the least. And then I think in the last couple of months, we've seen the South China Sea and some of the maritime disputes between China and the Philippines race back into the headlines, and the Sierra Madre in particular, as food and resupply to that ship have been intercepted by various elements of the Chinese Navy and Coast Guard and maritime militia. So let's talk a bit about your thoughts on where the alliance is, and what we could be doing more in the South China Sea in the years ahead. Harry, you want to start with you?
Sure. So I'll give a shout out to Phil on this one too. He started out by emphasizing to the Washington establishment the strategic critical necessity of the Philippines, especially in any conflict with China. So hats off to him for making that point so clearly. I believe that under the Duterte administration, it was a challenge. I used to characterize the Philippines as an ally that acted like a partner. They are a treaty ally of the United States. We're going to defend them if they are attacked by any nation, up to and including the PRC. We have an obligation, we have a historical, cultural obligation, and legal obligation to defend the Philippines. I think the expansion of the EDCA sites, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites, is important. I think the President Marcos has the right site picture on the challenge that faces the Philippines from the PRC. I was in the Philippines earlier this year. I do believe they get it also, and they're moving in the right direction politically and strategically and economically to face the PRC and underscore their treaty alliance with the United States.
That's
excellent. Anything, Phil, from you on the Philippines?
Yeah, I would just add, Harry's got it just right. I mean, I was, personally experienced the difficulty of dealing with President Duterte. But I have to tell you, the people-to-people ties, department to department, really across the whole of the cabinet structure, remain strong. We were able to co-sign in advance an EDCA document that established new sites in the 2019 timeframe. Now they weren't executable, but it was some progress to get moving on. And I should add, General Galvez was my counterpart during that timeframe, and now as the Secretary of Defense in the Philippines, we couldn't have a better partner at a department-to-department level. The other thing that I think America forgets is how close the people-to-people ties are with the Philippines, right? We have nearly 75,000 U.S. veterans living in the Philippines. We have a vast Philippine American and Filipino diaspora across the United States, certainly Hawaii and the Western United States, but really across the whole of the country. The alliance is deep. The partnership and friendship, I think, is even deeper. Then I think it's going to endure, for decades to come.
Yeah, that's well said. A very important alliance and relationship. In the last 6 or 7 minutes here, I just had 2 other questions. The first, we kind of discussed in passing some of these multilateral initiatives that are relatively new in the region. Harry, you mentioned both AUKUS and the U.S.-Japan-Korea kind of trilateral relationship, which after some time off, has reemerged in the last year, and especially at Camp David just a few months ago. The Quad is part of this discussion as well. So I just wanted to turn it back over to you, Harry, and Phil, if you have any thoughts on these multilateral initiatives that are trilateral, that are quadrilateral, and what are the real value and opportunities there?
Yeah, so I'll just start off real briefly by saying the most important of these relationships is AUKUS. We're going to give Australia our crown jewels, right? Our nuclear submarine technology, in collaboration with the UK. We're going to give that to Australia. But as a word of caution, we are our own worst enemies in this. If we don't get ITAR right, that's the international rule set on technology transfer, our own rule set on sharing technology with other countries. If we don't get that right, AUKUS is dead on arrival. It is up to us to fix that so that we can broadly share our nuclear technology with Australia. They are committed. Phil already talked about the billions that they've poured into this, and the UK is committed. But if we don't get ITAR right, then this thing is going to fail, and it's on us to get that right so that we increase the capability of our allied nuclear submarine force to meet the threat from the PRC. So that's on us, and I hope that we get that right. The Quad is not a defense relationship. It's a multilateral relationship. It's important. It ties the United States with Australia, Japan, and India. I used to joke about it all the time. I want to have to come up with a new line, but the Big Ten has 14 teams and the Big 12 has 10 teams. So nothing says that the Quad has to have only 4 teams, right? I'll have to fix that once the collegiate realignment happens next year. But we ought to look for ways to expand the Quad. I was always asked, should South Korea be in the Quad? For sure. In my opinion, the UK should be in the Quad also. So we have to work on that, and we have to have a mechanism to actually do that. There is no mechanism to increase the size of the Quad because there's no Quad Secretariat. I've called for the formal forming of a secretariat for the Quad someplace in the region, most likely in India, but we need to do that to have a way to actually decide what issues to take on, short of the leaders themselves getting together, and how to expand it. With a trilateral cooperation, Japan, South Korea, and us, that's critically important. I think it's true statesmanship in action, what President Yoon has done. He visited Japan, the first sitting South Korean president to visit Japan in 12 years. I mean, that's statesmanship in action. And then they had the Camp David trilateral this year with President Biden and Prime Minister Kishida and President Yoon. I mean, that's hugely symbolic and also substantive. So I think the trilateral relationship is off to a great start with Yoon and Kishida and President Biden pushing on all cylinders to get this thing done.
Bill, any thoughts on?
Yeah, perfectly stated by Harry. And the only point I would add is, certainly registered in the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party of China. The establishment of AUKUS, the announcements of Japan alone, and then, the efforts of the Quad in combination, certainly noted. And again, very positive developments in the region, but Harry's got it right on.
So just in closing, last couple of minutes, maybe closing thoughts each. There's going to be a new commander sometime next spring, probably nominated this winter to replace Admiral Aquilino. I wanted to maybe start with you, Phil, your thoughts and recommendations to whomever that next commander is on the situation they face, as we discussed today, and maybe some of the priorities that they can capitalize on, and when they only have maybe 3 years in the seat.
Yeah, I don't want to be overly prescriptive. I mean, it's, one of the things that, I talk about with other commanders. I think, Eric, you and I exchanged notes about it this weekend, is, the security environment that each commander experiences is not necessarily unique, but it is distinct, usually, from the others. I think the overall trajectory of what Harry started, and he's been very gracious to some of the things I advocated for. Harry's clear articulation to the U.S. Senate about the lack of limitations in the Chinese portfolio when it came to conventionally, ground launch missiles, and when it came to their nuclear deterrent, things like that, really opened people's eyes and frankly opened the door so that I could walk through it. Some of the things that we've articulated in terms of everything: lethality, logistics, posture, the need for day-to-day deterrence. I see Long making better and taking it in the direction that he's got to acknowledge, based on how the security environment is evolving. He's got to adapt, the new relationship with Japan, new command and control organizations in Japan, trajectory and capability in Japan. AUKUS, it's evolving. Philippines and its changed state. People always ask, what do you hope your legacy is? I hope my legacy at Indo-PACOM is that they have the courage and conviction to assess the security environment as they see it before them and formulate strategic and operational level plans to address them. That's the key.
Thank you. Harry, closing thoughts.
Yeah. Look, I don't want to get in the business of advising the commander that's third in line after me, right? Because Phil took my place and Lung took his place, and now Paparo is going to take Lung's place. So I don't want to get into the business of advising Paparo, certainly through this public venue. If he asks, I'll be happy to talk to him, but I don't want to get in the business of preaching to him through a third party. That said, I agree with everything that Phil said. I mean, he stated it just right on. I think that Admiral Aquilino has taken everything that Phil laid out for him and taken it to the next level. And I think the Paparo would take it to the level after that. He's the right guy for the job. And I'm excited for the Indo-PACOM in the next few years. The good thing is Paparo, when he becomes a PACOM commander, he'll be right there in 2027, right in the open Davidson window. So let's see how that works. So thanks.
That's a very good point, 24 to 27. Well, thanks for this dynamic discussion. Thanks to our guests for joining us today. Thanks to our listeners for tuning in. Really appreciate you joining us this morning at AEI.